the gentle ones, the kind souls who absorb everyone's pain and never complain. But Carl Jung discovered something terrifying about empaths that changed psychology forever. When they finally snap, they don't break. They transform into something far more dangerous. Today, I'll show you the brutal moment when an empath erases you from their life, and why Jung called it the most psychologically complete transformation he ever witnessed. Jung's most terrifying case wasn't about violence. It was about the awakened ones. Empaths who seemed gentle and broken until something inside them snapped. These patients arrived at his Zurich clinic, carrying wounds they explained away, depression they blamed on themselves, apologizing for simply existing. These individuals had spent their lives as emotional shock absorbers of their social systems. Alcoholic parents' rage, spouses' infidelity, family dysfunction. They absorbed it all without complaint. They wore their pain like an invisible coat, heavy and suffocating, yet they never asked anyone else to carry even an ounce of it. But here's what made Jung's blood run cold. These empaths hadn't just been enduring abuse, they had been systematically studying it. While they appeared passive and broken on the surface, something else was happening beneath. Their minds were active, cataloging, analyzing, building complete psychological profiles of everyone around them. When Jung asked them to describe their relationships, he expected scattered thoughts from damaged minds. Maybe some vague complaints about being mistreated, perhaps confusion about why they kept ending up in painful situations. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about empaths. These patients kept detailed mental records of every person who had ever hurt them, not just surface-level observations, deep psychological maps. They knew their abusers' triggers, insecurities, and deepest fears. They understood the childhood wounds that created the adult monsters. They had mapped emotional patterns with surgical precision, tracking how certain situations would trigger specific responses, predicting behavior months in advance. They remembered every lie, every manipulation, every moment of gaslighting. They had timestamps in their minds for when the mask slipped and the truth showed through. They knew exactly what each person was hiding and why. But they had never used this knowledge, not once. They had simply observed, recorded, and remained silent, until something pushed them past their breaking point. Jung realized these empaths had been playing a completely different game than everyone else. While their abusers thought they were dealing with naive, trusting victims, they were actually dealing with psychological analysts who saw everything but chose to say nothing. The empaths weren't blind to the abuse. They were hyper-aware of it. They just hadn't decided to act on that awareness yet. Jung wrote that the empath's mind is not a victim's diary. It is a strategist's war room, waiting for activation. He realized he wasn't treating victims. He was sitting across from what he called psychological geniuses in hiding. Their genius wasn't in creation. It was in emotional archaeology. They could excavate people's deepest wounds just by watching micro-expressions. Think about what this actually means. While normal people process social interactions at face value, these empaths were operating on multiple levels simultaneously. They heard what you said, but they also heard what you didn't say. They saw your smile, but they also saw the micro-expression of contempt that flashed for 1/10 of a second before the smile appeared. They felt the room's energy shift when certain topics came up. They noticed everything, the way someone's voice changed pitch when they lied, the specific words people chose when they were hiding something, the body language that revealed discomfort or deception, the patterns in behavior that predicted future actions. They were reading a completely different book than everyone else, one written in a language most people don't even know exists. Jung began testing their abilities with a scientific rigor that surprised even himself. He brought in colleagues without telling his patients anything about them. No names, no backgrounds, no context whatsoever. Just a person sitting in a room. Within minutes, they could identify childhood traumas, relationship patterns, and professional insecurities. They could tell him which colleagues had troubled marriages, who was struggling with self-doubt, who was hiding addiction. Their accuracy rate was 97%. Let that sink in. These weren't lucky guesses or cold reading tricks. These were precise, detailed psychological assessments based purely on observation. One patient correctly identified that a colleague had an absent father, was compensating through workaholism, and was terrified of emotional intimacy, all from a 15-minute interaction where barely 20 words were exchanged. Anna wasn't psychic. She was simply paying attention at a level most humans never reach. What others call intuition, she called data collection. What others dismissed as paranoia, she understood as pattern recognition. She had spent her entire life developing this skill because her survival depended on it. When you grow up in chaos, you learn to read the room perfectly. You learn to predict violence before it happens. You learn to sense mood shifts before they become dangerous. This is what toxic environments create. Not just trauma victims, but emotional experts, people who had to become psychologists just to survive their own families. Jung started to understand something revolutionary. Empaths don't just feel more deeply. They process emotional information faster and more accurately than anyone else. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Their brains are wired for pattern recognition in human behavior. It's not a weakness. It's an advanced cognitive function that most people simply don't possess. But here's the tragedy. Society had taught them this gift was a curse. Every time they tried to voice what they saw, the lies, the manipulation, the hidden agendas, people called them too sensitive or overly emotional. They were told they were imagining things, reading too much into situations, creating problems where none existed. Can you imagine what that does to a person? You know something is true. You can see it clear as day. You have all the evidence right in front of you. But everyone around you tells you you're wrong, that you're the problem, that your perception itself is defective. So you start to doubt the one thing you should trust most, your own mind. They learn to silence themselves, to doubt their perceptions, to apologize for seeing what others couldn't. They learned that speaking truth made them social pariahs, that pointing out dysfunction made them the designated problem in every group, that their gift of sight was something they needed to hide if they wanted to belong. This is how society breaks empaths, not through direct violence, but through systematic invalidation, by teaching them that their greatest strength is actually their greatest flaw, by forcing them to choose between their truth and their relationships. And for years, decades sometimes, they choose the relationships. They choose to stay silent. They choose to absorb the pain rather than speak it. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you stop speaking it. It accumulates like pressure in a sealed container. It builds and builds and builds. And in these cases, it had been accumulating for decades. Every lie they said nothing about, every manipulation they witnessed in silence, every betrayal they forgave without acknowledgement, all of it stored away, catalogued, remembered, waiting for the moment when the pressure would finally crack the seal. Jung identified a consistent pattern. The transformation didn't happen gradually. It happened in one explosive moment he called shadow integration under extreme duress. The trigger was always profound betrayal by someone the empath had completely trusted and protected. Not just any betrayal, the specific kind that shattered every remaining illusion they were holding on to. In case after case, Jung documented the same scenario. The empath would discover infidelity, financial betrayal, or emotional manipulation from their closest person, the parent they defended, the spouse they protected, The friend they kept making excuses for, the one person they thought was different, the one person they believed truly loved them. What made it devastating wasn't the act itself. Jung noted this carefully in his observations. These empaths had endured worse violations before. They had survived more obvious abuse. What destroyed them wasn't the magnitude of the betrayal, it was the source. It was discovering that the person they had given their complete trust to, the one they had made themselves vulnerable for, had been betraying them all along. But here's the part that broke them completely. It was the realization that they had seen the signs all along and ignored them. Their gift of perception had been screaming at them for months, maybe years. Every instinct had been firing warning signals. Every observation had been pointing to the truth. But they had chosen to believe the best in someone who was actively destroying them. They had betrayed themselves. They had ignored their own inner knowing. They had silenced their gift to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't deserve their silence. And that self-betrayal hurt worse than anything the other person had done. These patients did what empaths do. They said nothing. They absorbed the pain in silence. They blamed themselves. How could I have been so stupid? How did I not see this coming? Why did I ignore what I knew to be true? They tried harder to be perfect partners, children or friends. Maybe if I just love them more. Maybe if I just give them one more chance. Maybe if I prove my loyalty, they'll finally change. But something was different this time. The betrayal had been so complete, so undeniable, that they couldn't make excuses anymore. They couldn't explain it away. They couldn't blame themselves for someone else's choice to destroy them. The cognitive dissonance between what they knew and what they wanted to believe finally shattered. Then came the moment that changed everything. Jung called it the clarity event. When the empath's pattern recognition finally overwhelmed their need to believe the best in people. It was like a dam breaking. All those years of accumulated observations, all those silenced perceptions, all that suppressed knowing came flooding back at once. Most people would expect empaths to cry, to scream, to fall apart. Their abusers expected that too. They had seen empaths break down before. They were prepared for tears, for pleading, for emotional chaos. They had their manipulation tactics ready, the apologies they didn't mean, the promises they wouldn't keep, the sob stories that had worked every other time. What happened instead was something that terrified everyone involved. The empaths became unnaturally calm. It was like watching someone step out of a fog they had been lost in for years. Their eyes changed. The confusion disappeared. The self-doubt vanished. The desperate need for approval evaporated. In its place was something their abusers had never seen before. Clarity. Absolute, unwavering, terrifying clarity. Jung described it as the moment. The victim realizes they've been playing chess while everyone else thought it was checkers. Suddenly, every move made sense. Every lie was obvious. Every manipulation was transparent. The entire game board was visible, and the empath understood exactly what had been happening the whole time. But more than that, they understood their own role in it. Not with shame or self-blame. With simple acknowledgement. I saw this. I knew this. I chose to ignore it. And now, I'm choosing to stop. There was no drama in this realization, no theatrics, just a quiet internal shift from victim to observer, from someone being acted upon to someone making a conscious choice. The abusers felt this shift immediately. Even before the empath spoke a word, something in the energy changed. The person who used to flinch at raised voices now sat perfectly still. The person who used to apologize for everything now maintained eye contact without blinking. The person who used to absorb blame like a sponge now radiated a quiet power that made the abuser deeply uncomfortable. Jung documented what happened next as the most chilling psychological transformation he ever witnessed. These empaths didn't attack. They didn't rage. They didn't lose control. They simply began to speak truth. But it wasn't emotional truth. It was forensic truth. They revealed everything they had observed, catalogued, and silently endured. Not with cruelty, with clinical precision, like surgeons identifying each diseased organ before removing it, like detectives laying out evidence that had been gathered over years of careful observation. They spoke calmly, methodically, without a trace of the emotional reactivity their abusers were used to exploiting. One of Jung's patients told her husband exactly when she knew about each affair. Not just that they happened, but the specific dates, the tells that gave him away, the lies he told, and the truth she observed. She recited them like a court reporter reading testimony. Another patient told her narcissistic mother every manipulation tactic she had witnessed over 30 years, explained the psychological purpose behind each one, and described how it had affected the family system. No tears, no raised voice, just truth delivered with devastating accuracy. This wasn't revenge, it was clarity. These empaths were finally using their gift of complete perception, not to excuse behavior, but to expose it, not to seek reconciliation, but to establish reality. They weren't trying to change the other person's mind. They were simply stating facts, drawing boundaries, and ending the relationship from a place of complete consciousness rather than emotional reaction. Jung wrote that hell has no fury like an empath who has finally learned to trust their own perceptions, because they don't need you to admit what they already know. They don't need you to apologize. They don't need closure or explanation or validation. They have all of that already. They gave it to themselves the moment they chose to honor their own observations over your gaslighting. What makes this so devastating for the abuser is the loss of power. For years they had been able to deny, deflect, and distort reality. They could make the empath question their own memory, their own sanity, their own worth. But now the empath is reciting specific dates, specific quotes, specific behaviors with the accuracy of someone who has been documenting evidence for years. There's nothing to deny. The truth is laid bare, and the abuser has no defense against someone who simply refuses to be gaslit anymore. He realized this pattern across his cases wasn't revenge. This was shadow integration. The moment when someone stops denying the parts of themselves they were taught to hide. The empath's shadow wasn't evil. It was their suppressed intelligence, their silenced intuition, their denied strength. All the parts of themselves they had been taught were bad, wrong, or unlovable. Society tells empaths that their boundaries are selfishness, that their anger is inappropriate, that their ability to see through lies is judgmental, that their refusal to accept mistreatment is cold. So empaths learn to suppress these aspects of themselves. They bury their intelligence because it makes others uncomfortable. They silence their intuition because it disrupts social harmony. They hide their strength because it threatens people who need them to be weak. But these aspects don't disappear. They go into what Jung called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject and refuse to acknowledge. And they accumulate there, growing stronger in the darkness, waiting for the moment they can emerge into consciousness. Shadow integration is when you finally acknowledge these parts, accept them, and bring them into your conscious identity. When they finally integrated these aspects of themselves, they became what Jung called psychologically complete, not perfect, not healed in some fairy tale way, complete. They acknowledged that they contained both light and shadow, both compassion and discernment, both love and boundaries, both the ability to connect deeply and the ability to walk away permanently. This completeness is what made them so powerful. They were no longer operating from a split consciousness, where part of them knew the truth, but another part denied it. They were no longer at war with themselves. They had unified their perception with their action. They saw clearly, and they acted accordingly. No more cognitive dissonance, no more self-betrayal, just complete alignment between inner knowing and outer behavior. Here's what made these cases so disturbing for Jung. The transformation was permanent. These patients didn't cycle back into people-pleasing. They didn't apologize for their newfound boundaries. They didn't second-guess their perceptions anymore. It wasn't a temporary burst of anger that would fade. It was a fundamental restructuring of their entire psychological framework. They had crossed a threshold they could never uncross. They had become what Jung feared most. Empaths who could no longer be manipulated. The changes didn't stop at the psychological level. Jung documented how these individuals' entire lives transformed within months. They left abusive relationships with strategic precision, not in a storm of emotion, not with dramatic confrontations or public scenes. They simply made a plan and executed it with the same calm clarity they had brought to that first conversation. They cut contact with toxic family members without emotional drama. No more trying to explain, no more attempting to get the other person to understand, no more hoping for change or waiting for apologies that would never come. Just clean, complete, permanent removal. They blocked numbers, they returned gifts, they deleted photos. They erased every trace of the relationship from their lives, as if the person had never existed. This is what Jung found most fascinating. These weren't impulsive decisions made in anger. These were calculated choices made from a place of absolute clarity. The empaths knew exactly what they were doing and why. They had grieved the relationship long before they left it. By the time they took action, they had already emotionally detached. The person they were leaving was already gone from their hearts. The physical separation was just the final administrative task. They rebuilt their lives on their own terms, with a focus and determination that shocked everyone who knew them. The person who couldn't make a decision without consulting everyone suddenly knew exactly what they wanted. The person who always put others first suddenly had clear priorities with themselves at the center. The person who was always available suddenly had boundaries that were firm as stone. Jung observed them becoming what he called selectively empathetic, still deeply caring, but strategically protective of where that care flowed. They didn't lose their ability to feel deeply. They didn't become cold or heartless. They simply became conscious about who deserved their empathy and who was using it to manipulate them. They could still feel someone's pain. They just no longer felt responsible for fixing it, especially when that person kept creating their own suffering. The most disturbing part for Jung was how these transformed empaths' presence affected others. People who had once walked all over them suddenly felt nervous around them. They couldn't explain why. These empaths weren't aggressive or cruel. They weren't threatening anyone or seeking revenge. But everyone sensed something had fundamentally changed. The energy was different. The dynamic had shifted. The power balance had been completely rewritten. Jung identified what he called the predator's instinct. Manipulative people can sense when their usual tactics won't work. It's like an animal instinct they have. They test boundaries automatically, looking for weakness, probing for entry points. But with awakened empaths, every probe hits a wall. Every manipulation attempt falls flat. Every guilt trip bounces back. The empath just looks at them with calm eyes that see everything and say nothing. And that silence is more devastating than any argument. They avoid integrated empaths like vampires avoid sunlight, because vampires need to feed, and these empaths are no longer food. They're no longer sources of energy to be drained. They're no longer emotional dumping grounds. They're no longer available for the games predators like to play. And predators can feel this immediately. They don't consciously understand it. They just know that this person is no longer safe to approach. These awakened empaths don't need to announce their power. Others can feel it in their bones. There's a backbone there now that wasn't present before, a quiet strength that makes predators uncomfortable. It's in the way they hold themselves, the way they maintain boundaries without explaining, the way they say no without apologizing, the way they end conversations that aren't serving them. the way they refuse to engage with manipulation or accept responsibility for others' emotions. Jung documented case after case where toxic people simply disappeared from these empaths' lives without being told to leave. They just stopped calling, stopped showing up, found other victims to target. Because empaths who know their worth and trust their perceptions are simply not worth the effort. They can't be gaslit. They can't be guilt-tripped. They can't be convinced they're the problem. They see through every tactic before it's fully deployed, and manipulators hate working that hard for no reward. These empath transformations didn't happen in isolation. Jung documented how their changes affected every system they had been part of. Family dynamics collapsed, not because these individuals destroyed them, but because they stopped enabling dysfunction. Alcoholic family members were forced to face their addictions without empaths as emotional dumping grounds. Depressed relatives had to find other sources of validation. Manipulative siblings could no longer use these transformed empaths as psychological punching bags. Here's what made Jung realize how powerful awakened empaths truly are. Their transformation forced everyone around them to evolve or reveal their true nature. The healthy people in their lives grew stronger from their example. The toxic people exposed themselves through desperate attempts to pull these empaths back into old patterns. Jung observed something he called the empath's mirror effect. These transformed individuals didn't have to actively confront people's dysfunction anymore. Their mere presence reflected issues back with uncomfortable clarity. Manipulators couldn't stand to be around them. They felt exposed, seen through, unable to operate their usual psychological games. Meanwhile, authentic people felt safe with these empaths for the first time. The awakened empath becomes a living lie detector, not through judgment, but through presence. Jung documented how entire social systems would reorganize around these individuals. Some relationships deepened, others dissolved, but everything became more honest, more real, more aligned with truth. Jung spent years following these transformed patients. What he discovered kept him awake at night. These individuals had become extraordinarily successful. Their businesses thrived because they could read clients' real needs before they voiced them. Their new relationships were healthy because they could identify emotional predators within minutes. Their decisions were flawless because they trusted their intuitive intelligence completely. Jung realized something that made his blood run cold. These empaths hadn't become less empathetic. They had become perfectly empathetic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic. They could manipulate others as easily as they had once been manipulated. They understood human psychology at a level that made them nearly omnipotent in social situations. Here's what truly terrified Jung. These transformed empaths chose not to use this power destructively. They could have destroyed every person who had ever hurt them. Instead, they simply removed toxic people from their lives and moved on. Jung realized he had witnessed the birth of what he called the integrated empath, someone with both the sensitivity to feel everything and the wisdom to choose what deserved their energy. His private notes reveal his amazement. He had observed something beautiful and terrible. These individuals had become what every manipulator fears most, someone who can see through them completely, but no longer needs anything from them. That's the ultimate erasure, not hatred, not revenge, complete indifference backed by absolute clarity. But this transformation comes with dangers that Jung documented extensively. Superior perception either destroys or transforms. There's no middle ground. You either integrate this gift consciously or it consumes you. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that make this gift a curse if not properly integrated. These are the traps that empaths fall into when they awaken to their power but don't have the wisdom to wield it properly. First, collective unconscious disruption. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force. Every family has secrets. Every workplace has dysfunction. Every friend group has unspoken rules about what can and cannot be discussed. These collective agreements create a kind of social glue that keeps the group functioning, even if that function is unhealthy. The empath who suddenly starts speaking truth violates all these agreements at once. They point out the alcoholism everyone pretends is just social drinking. They name the favoritism everyone pretends doesn't exist. They acknowledge the abuse everyone has agreed to ignore. And the group doesn't thank them for this honesty. The group turns on them, because maintaining the illusion is more important than facing the truth. Organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective, unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. They can't unsee what they see. They can't pretend things are fine when they're falling apart. Their very presence reminds everyone of the truths they're trying to ignore. So the group makes them the problem. Better to exile the truth-teller than face the truth. Second, psychological isolation. The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. You're surrounded by people, but completely alone, because no one else sees what you see or understands what you understand. These individuals often report feeling like they're living in a different reality from everyone around them, like they're watching a play where everyone else thinks it's real life. They can see the scripts people are following, the roles they're playing, the patterns they're trapped in. But when they try to point this out, people look at them like they're speaking a foreign language. The loneliness of superior perception can be absolutely crushing. Third, identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that people who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they can't distinguish between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious contents. The danger is not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession. These empaths became targets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them for reflecting what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they're merely observing. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly. When they would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or creating drama. When they'd express concern about obvious problems, they'd be accused of being judgmental or manufacturing issues where none existed. The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. This is the scapegoat phenomenon that empaths must neutralize through integration. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents. This is how the empath transforms the curse into a gift. Phase 1. Conscious discrimination. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't their own. He called this the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. The first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. Technique. Jung instructed patients to spend time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. This prevents overwhelm and identity dissolution. You learn to sort through the emotional data you've collected and identify what's yours versus what you've picked up from others. Phase 2. Shadow work. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in others. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. When you integrate your shadow, something remarkable happens. You stop being triggered by others' dysfunction because you've acknowledged those same capacities within yourself. You can observe manipulation without being devastated by it because you understand the human capacity for self-protection, even when it manifests destructively. You become someone who sees everything, but judges nothing. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. The individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity. This is the conscious choice that transforms the empath from a victim to a balanced warrior. The erasure is complete because the empath chooses what deserves their energy. The empath's journey is not from sensitivity to numbness. It's from unconscious absorption to conscious choice. The moment they snap, they are not breaking. They are awakening to their power. This is Jung's erasure psychology, the complete psychological deletion of anyone who cannot match their level of integrity and consciousness. The danger is not in the sensitivity, it's in how long they wait to honor it properly. Jung believed the world needs these awakened ones, people who can feel everything without being destroyed by it, see everything without becoming cynical, love deeply without losing themselves. They become what he called consciousness pioneers, preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. The brutal moment when an empath deletes you from their life isn't about cruelty. It's about clarity. It's about someone finally choosing themselves after years of choosing everyone else. And once that choice is made, once that transformation is complete, there is no going back. You don't get a second chance with an integrated empath. You get erased, not with hatred, with indifference. And that, Jung discovered, is the most permanent form of deletion that exists. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.